They say that the forest holds its breath just before the first snow, and it was on such a night that an old cobbler sat late at his bench. The wind whipped down the ridge with a thin, lonely sound and whistled through the cedar shakes of his shack. His wife was already to bed, bundled under a mountain of heavy quilts, and the fire had burned down to a low orange huddle in the hearth. This man was usually a hard-working and happy fellow, but the world had grown heavy. Times had turned hard on the ridge. There was no money for new leather. Folk were patching the soles of their shoes with cardboard rather than coming to him for fixing, much less buying new shoes. And now he had nothing left but his heavy cast-iron cobbler's kit and his last, best scrap of tanned hide. He had saved it, hoping for better times, and now it stared at him, thin, supple, and as rich as the plowed fields in spring. Taking this last piece of precious leather, the cobbler sorted through his well-worn patterns, choosing the one that would fit just right. He traced with a steady hand, carefully cut each piece, and then laid them out, ready for stitching in the morning. Still sitting at his workbench, the cobbler quietly said his prayers. He didn't ask for a miracle. He just asked for the strength to finish his work well come sunrise. Whatever would be, would be. Then the old man blew out the candle and followed the darkness to bed. When the gray light of morning finally crept over the windowsill and the fire was set to crackling to chase away the chill, the cobbler sat down to his bench and reached for his well-worn awl. But he dropped his arm in shock and sat still staring. There, right where he'd left the cut shoe leather, was a pair of boots so stout and so fine that they seemed otherworldly. "Look at these boots, wife," he called out, his voice thick with wonder. The cobbler's wife turned from her kettle, wrapped her shawl tight against the chill, and rushed over to her husband's workbench. Peering over her husband's shoulder, she looked with amazement at the finished boots in her husband's hands. He pointed to a perfectly stitched seam. "There's not a man on these mountains who could pull a stitch that tight." Together they wondered who could have come in the dead of night without their knowing and leave behind such a near-perfect set of shoes. That same morning, before the sun cleared the pines, a traveler came up the hill and knocked on the door of the cobbler's cottage. The stranger had wandered high and low, crossing ridges and fording creeks in a desperate search for a good pair of boots for his journey. He'd found nothing but shoddy work and stiff leather, but when he laid eyes on the boots resting on the cobbler's workbench, his eyes lit up. The traveler quickly slipped on those boots and paced the floor. Why, they fit his feet like a second skin and felt as sturdy as the mountain itself. The stranger was so overcome with pleasure that he pulled out twice the asking price from his purse. "I won't take a penny less for them," he insisted, "because that's the least they're worth. I've a long road ahead of me, and I'd sooner walk it with a light heart than a heavy debt." As the traveler stepped back out into the morning mist, he turned and promised to spread the word far and wide, telling folks of the excellent workmanship of the hillside cobbler. With the coins heavy in his pocket, the cobbler didn't waste a moment. The old man near slid down the hill to the tanner's, his heart light as a bird. He knew exactly what he wanted. For months he'd been eyeing a piece of calfskin leather, so soft and supple it felt like silk, but with a grain as tough as oak. He fingered it every time he stopped by, knowing it would make the finest boots in the county, but he had never been able to claim it. That day he laid his money down with a grin and carried the calf hide home like a treasure. Before the sun had set, the shoemaker had traced out and cut 2 more pairs of boots, the best he'd ever created, laying them carefully over his iron lasts. He went to bed with a new hope, hardly able to wait for the next morning's work. Dawn came and the cobbler went whistling to his bench. But shortly the tune faded from his lips. He stood there, rooted to the floor. Surely his eyes were playing tricks. There sat 2 pairs of completed boots, the edges burnished smooth, and the honey gold leather gleaming with a luster that only comes from the finest handiwork. Just like the day before, those boots didn't sit long on the cobbler's workbench. Folks bought them up by noon, and the silver that the cobbler earned was enough to buy a whole roll of the finest leather, enough for 4 pairs of boots. It went on just that way time and time again. 8 pairs of the best boots, then 16. What the old man cut out in the evening was finished by the time the rooster crowed the next morning. Word traveled through the gaps and past the ridges, and soon the hillside cobbler had a steady stream of folks at his door. The ridge, once so quiet and heavy with worry, was now alive with the sounds of visitors and the clink of their coins filling the stone jar. The lean years were behind them. The flour barrel stayed full. There was meat hung in the smokehouse, and the cobbler's hands were never idle. Now it happened that one evening, not long before Christmas, after the old man had just finished cutting out his leather for the day, he turned to his helpmeet by the hearth. "Wife," he said, "we've been blessed beyond our deserving. What think you if we stay up tonight? I'd like to see the face of the neighbor who's been leaning into this work for us." She liked the idea, for she was a woman who believed in meeting a kindness face to face. So the cobbler and his wife didn't blow out the lantern this time. Instead, they turned down the wick and tucked the low light behind a stone crock. Then they hid themselves behind a row of heavy coats and waited in the dark. Their only company was the slow tick of the clock and the crackling of the fire, until the clock struck the deepest hour of the night. At midnight, the air in the room changed, turning as sharp and crisp as a mountain frost. 2 tiny figures no taller than new-sprung corn came hopping through a gap in the window frame. They were wee folk of the forest, but they weren't wearing the velvet or the lace of the old world stories. They were bare as the day they were born, their skin pale and shimmering like moonlight on the forest pond. Their hair wild as briars on the side of their heads, and their eyes held the spark of the North Star. The wee men didn't waste a second. With a nimble leap, they were up on the workbench, moving among the tools like they'd been born to them. Their little fingers moved like hummingbirds, pulling thread through the leather with a speed that made the cobbler's eyes ache to watch. They worked with a frantic, feverish delight, their tiny hammers making a sound like hail on a tin roof. The moment the last knot was tied, they didn't say a word. They simply faded back into the night as quietly as they came. The next morning, the shoemaker's wife studied the neat line of newly stitched boots sitting on her husband's workbench. And then she gazed back at the frosty window. "Husband," she said softly, "those little men saved us from starvation, yet they haven't a stitch of clothing to cover them against the cold. It's a poor heart that isn't grateful. I'm going to sew them some proper clothes, woolen coats and breeches, warm flannel shirts, and knit them each a pair of fine stockings. And I," said the cobbler, "will make them the best sturdy boots ever seen." So, on Christmas Eve, instead of leather, they laid out their gifts: perfectly stitched little pants, 2 shirts, 2 warm coats, stockings, and the finest pairs of little boots ever seen. The cobbler and his wife watched from the shadows as the wee folk returned. When the little men saw the warm clothes and the tiny sturdy boots, they didn't just put them on, they celebrated. The little men hooted and danced across the floorboards, their new boots clicking against the wood with a rhythm so true that they burst out in song. Woolen coats and boots so new, we finished all we came to do. Fine as kings and twice as free, no more cobblers will we be. They danced right out into the snowy night and were never seen in that ridge again. But they left something behind that didn't go away with them. The cobbler never wanted for work again, and his hands never lost their steady strength. He lived out his days with a full heart, always remembering that even in the leanest years, if you lay the leather out, the help will find you. Do you know that spot where Goose Run meets the edge of the hardwoods? Back in the day, there was a cabin there, and in it lived a man and his 3 sons. The youngest boy was named Jack. People all around the gap thought he was loony, because he rarely spoke a word. He was poked fun at and mistreated everywhere he went, but Jack was simply a boy who didn't care for the noise of the world. One morning, the oldest boy, Silas, headed into the forest to cut wood. He carried a lunch his mother packed him, a delicious meat pie and jug of cider to keep his belly full while he worked. As he climbed the shaded slopes, a little old gray man stepped out of the brush and said, "Morning, son. That pie has a scent that would draw a man a country mile. I've a terrible hunger and a thirst to match. Could you share a bite and a sip from your jug?" But Silas felt it wise to look out for oneself. "If I give to you, I'll be the one with the empty belly before the sun hits its peak. I ain't carrying enough to feed every wanderer I meet in the timber. I've got nothing for you. Now move along." Silas left the old man standing in the shadows, found the stand of timber, and set to work on a sturdy oak. The woods rang with the steady thwack of his blade. But Silas hadn't been at it long when he swung for a clean bite, and the axe kicked back off a frozen knot and bit deep into his own arm instead. Silas let out a holler that shook the crows from the pines, and he was forced to head home to get bound up. Come next morning, the second son headed out into the woods, for the fires had to be fed. His mother sent him off with 2 big corn cakes and a jug of cider, just like his brother. As the second boy made his way up the ridge, that little old gray man stepped out of the brush, begging for a morsel and a drink. But the second son was just as stingy as his brother. He said, "What I give to you is something I've gone and lost myself. Move on with you." Well, this boy didn't get to fell a single stick of wood before the axe head twisted, biting deep into his shin. He let out a yell that could be heard clear down at the creek. It took 2 men to haul him down the ridge and back to the cabin to be mended. On the 3rd day, Jack stood up from his stool by the hearth. "Pa," he said, "let me go for once and cut wood." His father just shook his head. "Your brothers have already gone and lamed themselves, and you don't know the first thing about heaving an axe." But Jack kept on until his father had enough. "Well, go on then if you're intent on hurting yourself." His mother didn't bother with meat pie or corn cakes. She gave him the dry heel from yesterday's bread, and cider so sour it was nigh vinegar. When Jack reached the stand of hardwoods, once again that little old man stepped out from the brush. With a voice like dry leaves, he croaked, "I'm purely starvin'. Could you spare a bite?" Jack looked down at his jug and hard crust. "I only have a dry heel of bread and vinegar cider," he said. "But if you can stomach that, take a seat on this stump and we'll share it." They sat there among the ferns and the shadows, and wouldn't you know it, when Jack reached into his poke to pull out that hard heel, it had turned into a warm meat pie with a buttery, flaky crust. He uncorked his jug, and the smell of sour vinegar was gone, replaced by the sweetest of blackberry cordials. The little man smiled, and his eyes weren't so weary anymore. "Since you have a kind heart and share so willing, I'm going to send some luck your way. See that old skeleton of a tree yonder? Hew it down and you'll find something tucked in the roots." Jack put his shoulder into it and made quick work of felling the dead tree. When the trunk gave way and cracked open, there sat a goose with feathers of pure gold, shining like the sun had been caught and caged in its wings. Jack tucked the bird under his arm, and rather than turn home, he made his way toward town, figuring it best to find a new place to light for the evening. At that time there was an inn near the crossroads. The innkeeper had 3 daughters who were as curious as a pack of magpies. When they saw that golden bird, they couldn't think of anything else. The oldest girl waited until Jack had stepped out back, and she reached to pluck just 1 golden feather. But the second her fingers brushed the wing, she stuck fast as pine sap on a wool blanket. The second sister came running to pull her away, but as soon as she touched her sister's sleeve, she was caught too. Then the third sister, not wanting to be left out of the riches, reached for the goose's tail, and there she stayed. Not a one of them could budge. They spent the night huddled together on the floor, stuck to that goose and each other. Next morning Jack looked at the mess of girls and goose, but he saw it wasn't a knot he could untie. So he tucked the goose back under his arm and walked out the door, paying no mind to the 3 girls trailing behind him. He just set a steady pace down the road, with the girls trotting and stumbling to keep up. Out in the fields, the preacher saw the parade. "Have you no shame, girls?" he hollered. "Chasing after that fool boy and bird like you've lost your wits." He reached out and grabbed the youngest by the hand to pull her home, but the second he touched her, he was joined to the string. Soon after, the deacon came running. When he saw his preacher being hauled along like a kite tail, he grabbed the man's coat to anchor him down. He stuck just as tight. Then 2 farmhands came with their hoes to break the chain, but they got caught just the same. Now there were 7 of them, jerking and jumping along behind Jack, who ignored it all and just kept his eyes on the road ahead. There was nothing he could do about it, after all. When they'd walked a fair piece, they came to a town where a king lived in a big house on the highest hill. The king had an only daughter, so heavy-hearted that no one could make her laugh. The king knew that life without laughter was no life at all. He figured that any man with the spirit to make his daughter find her joy again would be the right kind of man to walk beside her through life. So he'd put out the word. The one who could make her laugh was the one he'd welcome into the family. That very afternoon, the solemn silence of the big house was broken by the ruckus coming up the hill. It was the sound of hollering and bickering like the town had never heard. When that girl looked out the window and saw that long, tangled mess of folks, the 3 sisters, the preacher, the deacon, and the farmhands all jerking and jumping behind the quiet boy and his goose, she bust out laughing. A laugh that rang across the whole town square. A laugh that just wouldn't stop. Jack, for the first time in his life, felt the world go still. What a delicious feeling. He'd been looking for it his whole life. His days were filled with being laughed at and poked fun of, but when he looked up and saw the girl's face, he knew this laughter was different. This was the sound of someone who looked at him and found joy. And when he looked at her, he saw a spirit as quiet and deep as his own. He knew right then that if she'd have him, he could make a happy, peaceful life with her. Now, by rights, Jack had earned his place in the family. But the king looked down from his high porch and felt a seed of doubt. He saw Jack standing there, dusty and still, with his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if that string of bickering fools behind him didn't even exist. The king figured a man who could lead such a ruckus and never turn his head to look at the mess must be loony. He didn't much want a loon for a son-in-law. Wanting to see if the boy was as dim-witted as he looked, the king decided he'd set a trial to see what Jack was truly made of. The king called down to the square, his voice booming over the laughter. It's one thing to make a girl giggle, but it's another thing to be worthy of a place at our table. If you want to stay on this hill, you must find me a man who can drink every drop in my cider cellar, every last barrel, before the moon crests the ridge. Jack didn't say a word. He left his goose with the king's daughter, and in the handoff the stuck folks were set free. Jack just nodded, walked back toward the woods, straight to that skeleton of a tree. There, Jack found a man sitting on the stump with a face so long he could have stepped on his own chin. "What's ailing you, neighbor?" Jack asked. The man let out a groan that sounded like a rusty gate. "I've a thirst so deep a creek wouldn't wet my whistle. Water won't quench it, and I can't seem to find enough of anything else to put out the fire in my throat." Jack reached out a hand. "Well," he said, "I reckon I know a cellar of cider that's looking to be emptied." Jack led him to the king's big house, and that man went to work. He drank until the barrels were dry as a bone, and he was whistling a happy tune. The king was plumb flummoxed. He'd meant to drown Jack's hopes in cider, but instead he just ended up with an empty cellar. "Fine," the king snapped, his face turning a shade of red that matched a summer beet. "Any loon can find a thirsty man, but let's see you find a hungry one. If you want to prove you're worthy of a seat at my table, find me a man who can eat a mountain of biscuits before the dinner bell rings. If there's so much as a crumb left for the mice, you can take your goose and head straight back to the gap." Once again, Jack didn't say a word. He just tipped his hat, and headed back to the stand of hardwoods and the skeleton of a tree. There he found a man with a leather strap cinched so tight around his middle it looked like he was trying to squeeze himself in two. "You look like you're in a bad way," Jack said. "I'm downright famished," the man replied, his voice a mere whisper. "I've eaten nothing but wind and shadow for a week, and I'm so empty I'm afraid my ribs might touch my spine. I could eat a whole mountain and still have room for dessert." Jack gave him a nod. "I reckon I know a mountain of biscuits that needs moving." He led the man to the palace courtyard, where the king's cooks had been working since dawn. There sat a pile of biscuits as high as a hayloft, enough to feed the whole county for a winter. But the hungry man didn't hesitate. He set to work, and by the time the sun was low, there wasn't enough flour left in the yard to dust a moth's wing. The king's jaw dropped so low you'd think it was unhinged. He stood on his porch staring at the clean-swept courtyard. He had no more cider and no more biscuits, but he had one more trick up his sleeve. "All right, boy," the king growled. "You've emptied my barrels and you've cleared my plates, but a man of this house needs to travel far and wide. If you want to marry my daughter and call this hill home, you must bring me a boat that can sail as smooth over the dry ridges as it does down the river. Bring me that, or never darken my door again." Jack didn't even blink. He turned on his heel and walked back to the skeleton tree one last time. But the thirsty man was gone, and the hungry man was gone. Sitting there instead was the little gray man in the ragged coat. "You've been busy, Jack," the little man said with a twinkle in his eye. "The king is a hard man to please," Jack replied. "He is indeed, but you shared your bread with me when it was nothing but a dry heel, and you've looked after the folks I sent your way. Since you've been a good neighbor to the hungry and the thirsty, I'll be a good neighbor to you." The little man gestured behind him, and there sat a boat the likes of which Jack had never seen. It had the hull of a sturdy skiff, but the runners of a mountain sled, and its sails were woven from the silver mists of the gap. Jack took the helm and sailed that ship right up the king's hillside, gliding over the grass and stones as if he were riding a glass pond. When the king saw Jack coming over the ridge, sails billowing in the mountain breeze, he knew his excuses had finally run dry. He finally realized that Jack was not loony, but exactly the kind of man this hill needed. Quiet, steady, and not worried by the impossible. The king turned to his daughter, the weight of his own foolishness finally settling on him. "I set the trials and he met them all," the king said quietly. "The choice of a partner is yours to make, but you'll find no steadier hand than his." The girl walked down the stone steps and stood before the boat. She looked not at the golden goose she carried, or the magic ship in front of her, but straight into Jack's eyes. She saw the same delicious joy there that she had felt when she first laughed in the square. "I've spent a long time waiting for someone who sees the world like I do," she said, reaching out a hand. "If you're willing to walk the ridges with me, I'm more than willing to walk them with you." Jack took her hand with a nod of certain joy. The wedding was held the very next Saturday. When the king's time eventually passed, Jack took his place. He ruled the land with a quiet wisdom, never worrying over the knots he couldn't untie, but always looking after the neighbors around him. Next to the timber-thick forest, where the ridges rise so steep they swallow the sun by mid-afternoon, there lived a poor woodcutter and his 2 children, Arlo, and Alma. Being lonely after his wife passed, the woodcutter took a second wife, but she was a woman with a heart as cold as a January creek. Now a gray fog had settled over the valley in those days. It wasn't a mist that rose from the creek. It was a heavy, sour kind of gloom that seeped right into the folks that lived there. It made neighbors suspicious and turned kin against kin. People who used to swap seeds and help bring the hay in now barred their doors and guarded their barns. This sour spirit dried up the well of kindness, leaving neighbor to look past neighbor just when they needed each other the most. Without a hand to lean on or a shared hearth to warm by, the folks grew as thin as the shadows, for a holler that won't stand together is bound to starve alone. One night the woodcutter lay in bed, his stomach growling like a tethered hound. "Wife," he sighed, "the flour sack is empty and the larder is bare. My heart is heavy with the thought of Arlo and Alma gone without." But the stepmother, her mind already set, whispered into the dark, "There's a place on the other side of the ridge called the poorhouse. Tomorrow we'll make like we're heading deep into the timber to chop wood, but we'll lead 'em across to the far trail and leave 'em to be found. They'll have a roof over their heads, and we'll have a chance to see another spring." The woodcutter fought it with a few weak words, but the sour gloom had sapped his will, and before the fire had died to ash, he'd given his nod. Arlo and Alma, their bellies too empty for sleep, were huddled in the loft, and they heard every terrible word that passed below. Alma commenced to cry, and her tears wetting the straw tick, but Arlo squeezed her hand tight. "Shh, sissy," he whispered. "Don't you worry. I've got a way figured out to find our way back." He waited until the house went quiet and the woodcutter's snores joined the wind in the chimney. Then he slipped out the back door and crept down to the creek's edge. The moon was high, and the small, smooth stones shone like silver coins beneath the ripples. Arlo reached into the cold water, filling his overall pockets with the white rocks until they sagged. Then he slipped back to bed to wait for the sun. At first light, the stepmother roused them with a shake. "Get up, you lazy bones. We've got a long walk ahead of us if we're to get a load of wood cut today." She handed them each a thin crust of bread, warning them it was all they'd see until supper. As they started up the ridge, Arlo kept turning to look back toward the cabin. "Arlo, what are you mooning at?" Pa called out. "Just looking at my white cat on the roof, Pa. She's watching us go," Arlo lied. "That ain't no cat, you fool boy," the stepmother snapped. "That's just the morning sun hitting the chimney stones." But Arlo wasn't looking at any cat. He was dropping those smooth creek stones, one by one, marking a silver trail through the deep timber. When they reached the deepest part of the hardwoods, the father stopped in a small clearing. "You young'uns gather up some brush and deadfall," he said, his voice trailing off as he looked at the ground. "I'll make you a fire so you won't catch a chill while we work." Arlo and Alma piled up a mountain of dead wood, and once the flames were licking at the air, the stepmother turned to go. "Lie down and rest yourselves. We're going just over the rise to fell some trees. When the work is done, we'll come back for you." To keep their hearts from sinking, the father tied a dry branch next to a dead hemlock nearby. As the wind caught it, the branch went thwack, thwack against the trunk, sounding for all the world like a steady axe blade. Believing their father was close by, the children relaxed and fell into a deep, hungry sleep. When they finally woke, the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the woods were as black as the bottom of a well. Alma started to sob, but Arlo pulled her close. Wait for the moon, Sissy, just wait for the moon. Sure enough, when the full moon crested the ridge, those smooth creek stones began to glow like tiny lanterns in the dirt. Arlo took Alma by the hand, and they followed that silver trail all through the night. As the first light of dawn touched the valley, they walked right up to their own front door and knocked. The stepmother opened the door, and her face went pale as a ghost. But she quickly masked it with a scowl. "You wicked children, why'd you sleep so long in the timber? We thought you'd never come home." But the woodcutter didn't say a word. He just pulled them into his arms, his eyes wet with a relief he couldn't hide. Not a week later, the hunger returned twice as sharp, and the children heard their stepmother whispering to Pa once more. "There's nothing left on the shelves but dust, and we've only a dry heel of bread. We must take 'em even deeper this time. So far they can't find the trail. There's no other way for us to live through the winter." The woodcutter's heart was heavy as a millstone, but he'd given in once, and he found he hadn't the strength to say no this time either. Arlo again waited until the adults were snoring. Then he crept toward the door to gather more creek stones. But his stepmother was wise to his tricks. The door was barred tight, and the latch wouldn't budge. He went back to the loft and held Alma's hand. "Don't you cry, Sissy," he whispered. "I've got another way figured." Early the next morning, the stepmother rousted them and handed each a piece of bread even smaller than the last. As they walked toward the high ridges, Arlo didn't eat his crust. Instead, he crumbled it in his pocket, dropping tiny bits one by one onto the dirt. "Arlo, why are you always stopping and looking back?" Pa asked, his voice full of a weary kind of sorrow. "I'm looking at my pigeon on the roof, Pa. He's saying goodbye." "That ain't no pigeon, you simpleton," the stepmother hissed. "That's just the sun on the chimney." But Arlo kept silent, trailing the last of his bread until his pockets were empty and they were deep in the heart of the forest, where the shadows never truly leave. Once again a fire was built, and the children were told to wait while their parents went off to work. But this time no branch was tied to a tree to mimic the sound of an axe. The woods were dead silent. Arlo and Alma shared the girls' small crust and eventually fell into a sleep born of exhaustion. When they woke, the night was thick, and there wasn't a silver stone to be seen. "Don't worry, Sissy," Arlo said, his voice a little less certain than before. "When the moon comes up, we'll see the crumbs I dropped." But when the moon rose and washed the forest in light, the ground was bare. The mountain has its own residents. The crows and turkeys had pecked the path clean, leaving nothing but damp earth and fallen leaves. Arlo and Alma were truly lost. They wandered for 3 days and 3 nights, their legs trembling like jelly. They ate nothing but a few bitter winter berries they found beneath the brush. On the 3rd afternoon, they saw a little snow-white bird sitting on a low-hanging pine branch. It sang a tune so sweet, it seemed to pull the weariness right out of their bones. When it finished, it flapped its wings and flew ahead, looking back as if to see if they were following. The bird led them into a clearing where the trees fell back, and there sat a cabin the likes of which they'd never dreamed. The air was filled with the scent of boiling sorghum and wintergreen. The logs were chinked with white sugar. The roof was shingled in amber molasses candy, and the window panes were clear, jagged rock candy that caught the light like diamonds. Arlo reached up and snapped off a piece of the eaves, and Alma began to nibble a pink wintergreen lozenge from the porch rail. As the sugar hit their tongues, a strange, warm heaviness began to settle over them. The memory of their father's face blurred, and the forest cold didn't seem so biting anymore. It was a sweet, foggy comfort that made the world beyond the clearing feel like a dream they'd already forgotten. Then a voice as warm and sweet as a summer afternoon called out from inside. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who's that nibbling at my house?" The children froze, but the sugar had already begun to slow their senses. Arlo felt as though he were standing neck-deep in water, his limbs heavy and slow. "It's only the wind," he whispered, the words feeling thick in his mouth. He knew he should run, but the sugar mist in his head told him to stay. Before they could find their feet, the door creaked open. A woman stepped out, leaning on a locust wood cane. To their tired, clouded eyes, she looked like the finest mountain granny you could hope to meet. Her hair tucked under a clean white bonnet, and a smile so bright it seemed to light up the whole clearing. "La, you poor little birds," she softly said, her voice sweet as honey. "You look like you've been etched out of shadow. Come in, and don't you fret none. No harm's gonna find you under my roof." She led them inside and set a table that made their heads spin. Fried pies, ham, hot biscuits with yellow butter, and mugs of cold milk. Afterward, she tucked them into beds with quilts so soft they felt like clouds. Arlo and Alma drifted off thinking they'd finally found a piece of heaven. But the children had been fooled. The old woman wasn't a kind granny at all. She was a conjurer, and she was running out of time. Her youth was leaking away like water from a cracked jar, and she needed a lump vessel to perform the ritual to bring it back. The shack had been dressed in sweets to lure in a child for just that purpose. As she watched them sleep, a jagged grin transformed her kind face. "I've got 'em now," she hissed. "The moon is turning, and when this boy is fine and fit again, he's got just the kind of spark I need." Before the sun could burn the frost off the hemlocks, the old woman's kindness was gone. She snatched Arlo out of his warm bed with a grip that felt like iron hands. Without a word, she dragged him out to the small corn crib behind the house and threw him behind the wooden slats, rattling a heavy padlock into place. She stomped back inside and shook Alma awake. The face that had looked like a kindly granny's the night before was now a map of deep gray wrinkles, and her hands trembled. "Get up, girl. Go fetch water and boil the oats. My bones are turning to ash and my skin is thinning like parchment. You'll do the chores while I'm too old to manage." She leaned close to Alma, her breath smelling of soured milk. "Your brother's going to give me back what the years took away. I'm going to draw the youth right out of him and take it for my own. You'll stay and do the hauling and the heavy work while I fatten him up fit for my spell." Each morning the conjurer would limp out to the crib, her face aging more each day. She was mostly blind now, so she'd call out, "Arlo, put your finger through the slats so I can feel if you're getting some meat on your bones." But Arlo was sharp. He'd kept a chicken bone from one of his dinners. When the blind woman reached out, he held out that brittle bone. She'd squeeze it and grumble, "Still as thin as a winter's twig. I'm pouring the best of my larder into you, and you're staying as scrawny as a ghost." So she doubled his rations of ham and corn cakes. But not Alma. The witch meant to keep Alma dazed, on a diet of enchanted candies and stale pastries. Every night Alma would pitch them into the ash pit, then sit by Arlo as he passed the wholesome food through the slats of the corn crib, sharing his meal with his sister. Together they stayed sharp and waited. Each day as Alma worked, she learned more and more of the truth of their valley. Neighbors came to the conjurer from far and wide, trading their money, their silver pocket watches, and gold lockets for sour spells and hexes. The witch was the source of that gloomy gray fog that seeped through their valley, and she bled the holler dry. Weeks passed, and the witch's patience finally snapped. Her skin had grown so thin it looked like wet tissue stretched over bone. "I'll wait no longer. The moon is cresting and my time is up," she shrieked. "Stout or thin, scrawny or fat, I'm taking his spark today before I fade to nothing." The witch hobbled toward the root cellar built into the side of the hill. "I need the black root from the bottom shelf," she wheezed. "Go fetch it, girl." Alma knew it was now or never. She looked into the dark, damp hole and shook her head. "Which jar holds the black root, Granny?" Alma said, her voice slow and thick. "I don't know the herbs." "You useless, thick-skulled brat," the witch hollered. She was so frantic to begin the ritual before her heart gave out that she lost her own cunning. She leaned into the root cellar, gesturing with her locust-wood cane. "I'll find it myself." As the ancient woman disappeared into the shadows of the cellar, Alma grabbed the keys hanging from the witch's waist. With a strength born of 3 days of winter berries and 2 weeks of fear, she swung the heavy oak door around and slammed it shut, throwing the iron bolt home. A terrible, hollow shriek came from beneath the earth, and then silence. A fine puff of gray dust drifted out from under the door. Alma ran to the corn crib. Unlocking the chains, she released her brother from his prison. For a moment, they just held each other in the cold mountain air. "We have to go, Sissy," Arlo whispered. "Before the house goes, too." As they looked back, the cabin began to change before their very eyes. The sugar chinking turned to gray mud, the wintergreen lozenges shriveled back into bitter hemlock needles, and the molasses shingles crumbled into rotten bark. The candy house was nothing more than a rotting shack. In the ruins, they found the only real things the witch possessed: gold coins, watches, and lockets that the neighbors had traded for their misery. Arlo and Alma filled their pockets with the valley's stolen wealth and struck out, away from the clearing. The birds that had eaten their breadcrumbs now seemed to lead the way, chirping a path back through the deep stands of timber. By the time the moon rose, they saw a familiar sight: the steep ridges that would lead them home. The gray fog in the valley had begun to lift, and the night sky was clearing. For the first time in a long time, the neighbors had unbarred their doors. Arlo and Alma stopped at every cabin with an open door, returning treasures to the folks who had traded them away. When they reached their own cabin, the door was standing wide open. Their father was sitting on the porch, his face aged with a different kind of sorrow, the kind that comes from deep regret. Their stepmother was gone. She had followed her own bitter heart into the deep timber and never returned. And when the woodcutter looked up and saw Arlo and Alma, he let out a cry that echoed down the holler. He no longer saw mouths to feed. He saw his greatest treasure return to him. With the witch gone and the treasures returned, the people of the hollers started looking after one another again. And wouldn't you know it, even in the hardest winters that followed, Arlo and Alma never went hungry again. In the deep curve of the blue-misted valley, 2 mills sat on opposite sides of the same water. Miller Abner's was a small timber frame place, the wood smoothed by 3 generations of calloused hands. Downstream stood the Jones Mill, a sprawling fortress of white-painted siding and iron that grew with every passing season. For years now, Abner watched his orders drift downstream. He'd refused to let his spinners go, instead borrowing against his land and machinery. The day came when the debt grew bigger than the mill itself, and Old Man Jones and his son Silas rode up to Miller Abner's porch. "Abner," the elder Jones said, his voice grating like grit in a gearbox, "your debt's due. The interest has outrun the principal. If you can't pay, I've come for the deed to this holler." Abner sat in silence, hiding his panic and watching his daughter Marilla. She was inside by the hearth, her hands working wool with a grace that seemed to pull light from the shadows. Desperation is a fast-talking liar, and it took hold of Abner's tongue. "You might have a right to my deed," Abner said, his voice calm, despite the dread rising in his chest. "But you're throwing away the only thing that could make this valley truly wealthy. My Marilla, she's got a gift. She can take a pile of common oat straw and twist the very light of the room into it. She'll spin you a yarn so fine you'd swear it was pure gold." Marilla, quite aware of the predicament they all were in, heard her father's rash words and felt the world tilt. She watched the elder Jones and son exchange a heavy look. Old Man Jones turned to Marilla. "Girl, if you can prove your gift, we'll tear up your father's note. In fact, you can have a place in our family as Silas's bride. A girl like you deserves a share in a real business." Silas stepped out of the shadows, offering Marilla a quiet, kind smile that looked all the world like the way out of the storm. "We could do a world of good together, Marilla," he whispered. Marilla looked into Silas's soft eyes and reasoned if she could win the son, she could steer the old man. Miller Abner's face was the color of wood ash. He realized the stupid thing he had done. But before he could stop the unfolding drama, Marilla stepped past her father and proclaimed, "I'll do it." The Joneses swept Marilla down the ridge without even a bag. They locked her in an attic room with a mountain of straw and a giant spinning wheel, its spindle pointing at her like a silent finger. Before she could catch Silas's gaze for even a drop of kindness, the bolt slid home and she was alone. Now Marilla's only companions were the low rhythmic roar of the water wheel far below and the cold weight of her gamble lying in her chest. Then a dry, papery rustle, a shadow stirred in the heights. Marilla didn't scream. She had been raised on tales of the wee folk. She reached into her apron, found a small apple she'd meant to eat with her supper, and set it on the frame of the wheel. "I reckon you know the mess I'm in, standing here with nothing but a lie," she whispered. A shadow detached itself from a crossbeam and dropped onto the floor with the lightness of a leaf. He was a spindly thing, wearing a coat woven from spider webs and soot. His face was a knot of ancient wrinkles, and his eyes were a wide pair of circles that reflected the moonlight like a pair of creek pebbles. He picked up the apple, sniffed it, and took a bite. "The Joneses only bring me demands, never sweet apples," the little man said with a low rattle. "Why should I help a girl who's come to marry into such a sour house?" "Because I'm not like them," Marilla said, her voice growing stronger as she looked the creature in his moonlit eyes. "I'm here to save my father and our neighbors." The wee man cackled, a sound like dry husks rubbing together. "A trade, then. I don't work for free, and I don't work for apples alone. What will you give me to turn this straw into glittering yarn?" Marilla reached into her pocket for her mother's silver thimble. It felt heavy in her palm, a piece of her heritage she was now offering in trade to keep her daddy's mill standing. The little man accepted her offer and took in Marilla, his pale eyes narrowing. If I do the work, you're still just a prisoner. But if I teach you, well, the Jones don't own the magic. They only own the room it's in. And so, together they started. The wee man kicked the wheel. The horror filled the room like a singing note. Under his knobby fingers, the dry straw lost its teeth and felt like warm water. He showed her how to feel and spin with the mountain's heartbeat, a pulse that matched the river below. By dawn, the straw was gone. In its place sat 20 skeins of yarn that shone with a honeyed light. The little man had vanished, and the thimble with him. When the bolt slid back, Old Man Jones pushed inside. He didn't look at Marilla. He went straight to the bobbins, his fingers trembling with a raw, naked hunger. Silas followed, his gaze lingering on the piles of gold before it ever found Marilla's face. "You look like you've wrestled the sun, Marilla," Silas murmured. He reached out to take her hand, but his thumb brushed her gold-dusted palm in wonder rather than finding her eyes to offer comfort. "2 more nights, and your daddy's debt is settled." That evening they led Marilla to a room with a pile of oat straw twice as large as the first. Once the bolt clicked home, Marilla didn't wait. She set down a honey biscuit she had saved back for the strange little man. "I'm ready, little teacher," she whispered. The papery rustle returned. The little man looked leaner tonight, his eyes hungrier, and he snatched the biscuit. "The hunger of this house is growing, Miller's daughter," he hissed. "They see the gold and they want the world. This mountain of straw is twice the weight of last night's work, and my bones are twice as weary. It will take more than an apple and a thimble to turn all this into gold." Marilla's hand went to her throat. She unclipped her grandmother's gold locket. "This is the last bit of home I have left," she said. The little man took it, his fingers tracing the metal. Then he stepped to the wheel. "Tonight the rhythm is faster. You felt the heartbeat of the mountain yesterday. Tonight you must feel the pull of the river. It's water that turns this mill, and it's that power that will twist the golden light into your spinning." It was a fever of motion. Marilla sat at the bench, her arms burning. Her feet pumped a relentless beat that matched the churning water wheel below. Under the little man's guidance, she learned to bridge the gap between straw and sun, and the result was a thread of deep, burnished gold that seemed to hum. "You're learning," the little man whispered, his form beginning to fade back into the shadows as the first birds began to stir. "You're starting to own the wheel, Miller's daughter, but tomorrow they will ask for the impossible." The second morning, the Old Man Jones counted the skeins with a raw greed. Silas watched Marilla, his gaze calculating. "1 more night, the final test," he murmured, his hand remaining firmly on the doorframe as he blocked her path. "Then the debt is paid, and you are a Jones." When dusk arrived, they led Marilla to a room so vast the rafters were lost in the dark. Nor was it a mountain of straw this time. It was a sea, wall to wall, and deeper than a man is tall. Marilla sat at the wheel, her body leaden, waiting for her teacher. The little man dropped from the shadows, ragged and fraying. "I cannot spin this alone," he hissed, "and you have nothing left to pay me. If I am to turn this sea into golden yarn, you must give me a promise of what is yet to come." Marilla looked at the impossible task. "What could I possibly promise?" The little man cackled a bitter, sharp sound. "I was the breath of the valley once, with a name that tasted of pine and rain. But the Joneses took my name and used it to bridle me. They harnessed my spirit to the gears of this mill. Now I am their engine, But I taught you how to spin the light, and now you are the one thing they can't control. You will be a Jones tomorrow. You will have a house, a name, and soon a firstborn child. If you can give me back my name in 1 year's time, the name they've locked in their ledgers and whispered to the foundations, then we both can go free. But if the year turns and I am still tied to this mill, I will take your firstborn to turn the wheels in my stead. Marilla felt a cold sweat prickle her neck. This wasn't just a trade, it was a race. If I find your name, you're free and their hold is broken. Free as the wind, the strange little man said. Marilla looked at the vast golden sea of straw and then at the desperation hidden in the creature's eyes. She reached out and placed her hand on the wheel beside his. Then let's find the rhythm, she whispered, one last time. They worked in a fevered, desperate silence. The sea of straw vanished into the wheel as the thump hiss of the treadle kept time with the rushing river outside. By the time the first cold light touched the high windows, the warehouse was no longer filled with straw. In its place stood rows of shimmering bobbins that looked like columns of captured lightning. The little teacher faded once more into the rafters with a final haunting whisper. 1 year, miller's daughter. Give me back my name, or your child will be mine. The wedding was at noon, a quiet and cold affair. Her father's debt was settled, and the war for her future began. Marilla played the part of the Jones bride with a quiet, practiced grace, but beneath her fine dresses she remained a creature of the mill. She walked the floorboards, not as a mistress, but as a student of its secrets. She sat with the weary spinners, her fingers moving in the old patterns. She didn't just offer kindness. She shared the skills her little teacher had taught her, lightening their work. In return, the workers gave her their loyalty, and in time became her spies. Listen for the names the Joneses speak to the wind, she whispered to them. Listen for what they mutter when the gears jam. By night, Marilla scoured Silas's office ledgers, filling a notebook with every name she found in the ink-stained pages. But she feared these were only the names of men, and she was hunting the name of a spirit. In due time, a son was born, a beautiful boy with eyes as bright as the yarn his mother had spun. But not long after, that strange, wrinkled little man walked out of the nursery shadows. The year is done, miller's daughter. It's time for you to give me my name or give me your child. Marilla hurried to step between the creature and the cradle, hoping to bargain for time. It took 3 nights for you to teach me to spin gold, she said, her voice steady despite the sweat on her palms. I ask for the same grace, 3 nights and 3 guesses for each sunset. The little man paused. A dry, rasping cackle came from his throat. The apprentice asks for the master's mercy. Very well, 3 nights, but on the 3rd sunset, if I don't have my name, your child will be mine. And now, time for your first 3 guesses. Marilla fumbled for her notebook. Her eyes raced through the long columns of names she had harvested from the ledgers. But only 3 chances. Is your name Albert? She asked, her voice hitching. Or maybe it's Luther. Could it be Reuben? The little teacher threw back his head and laughed. Those are names of men who die in soft beds. You bring me names of men, but I am made of mountain and shadow. 1 night gone, 6 guesses left. He vanished like smoke, leaving nothing but a memory behind him. The next morning, Marilla went straight to the mill floor and gathered her friends around her. "It's not any of the names I've collected," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I have 2 nights left before he takes my son. Do you hear any strange names cross the Joneses' lips?" A grease-stained boy leaned in. "We can't help you there, miss. But we've seen the shadow man. The girls call him Heddlehaint on account of how the looms move even when the treadles are still. Some folks call him Master Mender since the belts are new every morning, and us boys have taken to calling him Spindleshank because of those long, thin legs of his." Marilla, desperate but doubtful, wrote those names in her notebook and watched the clock tick toward the next inevitable visit of that strange little man. The sunset bled across the valley like a bruise. Just as the moonlight hit the nursery window, the wee man appeared. "I'm here for your 3 guesses, Miller's daughter." Dread pooled in Marilla's gut. She had no secret name, only the scraps and whispers she'd gathered from the mill floor. She steadied her breathing, praying the creature might like the sound of himself in the workers' mouths. Maybe he'd let the child be. "The folks in this mill have seen your handiwork," Marilla said, offering the words like a tray of thin glass. "They've taken to naming you for it. Are you the Master Mender? Or maybe Spindleshanks?" She hesitated, then threw out the last of it. "Are you the Heddlehaint?" The little master's pale eyes flashed with anger. "They named me for the drudgery," his voice vibrating like a loose bolt. "I was not born to knot their broken threads and grease their rusted iron. Those are names for the iron collar the Joneses put on me, Miller girl. 2 nights gone, 3 guesses remain." With a loud clap, the little man was gone. By the 3rd day, Marilla was near collapse. She turned to the oldest woman in the mill. "The time is almost gone, Granny," her voice tight with a mother's panic. "I've checked every record of hires, every family tree. The name isn't there." "There has to be another ledger," Marilla sobbed. "Not the office books, the real book." The worn woman gripped Marilla's hand. "Mistress, I followed Old Man Jones into the wheel pit last night. He pulled out a small black-bound book and called a name, but I only caught the edges of it. It started with a fur and ended with a mournful keen. When he was done, he tucked the book into the masonry right behind the main bearing. He's hiding it where the water and the iron will guard it." Marilla's eyes widened. She remembered the little man's words, a name that tasted of pine and rain. She didn't wait. She ran down into the wheel pit, a roar of spray where the massive axle spun with a force that made her bones vibrate. She ignored the water soaking her silk dress as she reached into the damp hollow behind the shaft, a space that could crush her arm if she slipped. Her fingers clawed at the stone until they hit a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Out it came, and in it was the black diary. Her lantern light danced over the pages looking for the one thing that mattered. There, in the old man's handwriting, was scrawled the strangest of names. A curious conglomeration of syllables. Could this be it? She clutched the little book to her chest, desperate that it was. That night, when the strange little man appeared, his form was more solid than it had been in a year, as if he were already drawing strength from his pending freedom. "The time for games is over, Miller's daughter," he hissed. "Give me the name, or give me your child." Marilla stood tall and looked the little man straight in his tired, moon-pale eyes. "I couldn't find the truth among the names of men, nor could I find it in the hearts of those who work alongside you. But in the stones of the mill, I believe they're the ones that hide it." The wee man's eyes flickered. "The stone tells no tales." The stones remember everything, Marilla countered. I remember what you told me on the second night of our spinning. You told me you were the breath of the valley, that your name tasted of pine and rain. The little man froze. So let's end this game for both of us, little teacher. Is your name Thistledown Nary? No, the creature warily whispered. Soft as a man's bed. 2 more. Is it Burroak Peary? Harder, but still wrong. 1 guess left, Marilla. 1 guess before I claim my due. Marilla stepped forward, pulled out the little leather-bound book, and called out, Little man, your name is Furtus Douse Airy. The name hit the air like a thunderclap, and the strange wee man shrieked, not in pain, but in a terrible, wonderful cry of freedom. Then came the echoing scream of the mill. The main drive shaft snapped like a gunshot echoing across the ridge. The sound of twisting metal shrieked across the hills. The great water wheel shuddered and stopped. Free, Furtus whispered in wonder. You broke the machine. He gave Marilla one last look of grateful release, and then Furtus Douse Airy vanished into a shadow of mist and pine scent. The Joneses' reputation shattered as fast as their main shaft. Their stores of gold yarn had turned back into worthless dry oat straw. They were left with nothing but a mountain of waste and the skeleton of ruined machinery. Old Man Jones spent his remaining days wandering the wreckage, muttering to stones that no longer answered, while Silas fled the valley to escape the debt of lies his father had built on the back of a mountain sprite. Marilla left it all behind and didn't look back. She returned to her family mill with her son and the friends who had helped her. Prosperity spread throughout the valley, evenly this time, built with the hands of the workers and the steady honesty of the old mill. On the clearest of mornings, Marilla would walk the mill path to watch the breeze travel the valley. As if just for her, a tiny whisper of wind would whip across the valley floor and climb the hillside in a silver-green wave. Sometimes the breeze would dip down to join her, smelling of pine and rain. Then Marilla would go back to her work, the steady, rhythmic spin of her own wheel echoing the heartbeat of a free woman of the mountain. Ella's daddy always said the ridge had a mind of its own. On mornings when the fog lay soft and low, he'd stand beside her on the porch and nod toward the tree line as if it were an old neighbor. See how the ridge is holding her breath? He'd murmur. Wait till the sun clears that far knob. She'll let it go all at once. Watch close and you'll feel it. Ella held her breath, her bare toes gripping the plank floor. Then the sun would push up over the comb of distant hills, and the fog would shiver and lift in tatters, slipping back from the fence posts and blackberry brambles curling away from the creek. There, her daddy would say, the ridge let out her breath. He spoke of the land that way, as if it were alive and living life with them. Back then it was just Ella and her daddy and the ridge. They were blessed to have the low fields, rich bottom land that stayed green in August when other folks' gardens were dry. They had fields of corn, chickens, a few head of cattle. Ella loved the land, the barn with its deep, cool shadows, the ridge that framed the sky. But more than any of it, she loved walking the fences with her daddy, listening to him talk about how to tend a place, so it would remember you kindly. All of that was before anything changed on the ridge, before the strange envelopes came in the mailman's satchel, before Bernice. Bernice came to the ridge in a borrowed car with 2 girls squeezed in the back and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Girls," Bernice had said, voice sweet as sorghum, "this here's the farm I told you about, and this is Ella." There were suppers on the porch after that, and laughter that sounded harsh in the soft evening. Bernice slipped into the kitchen as if she owned it, touching Daddy's arm when she passed. Before summer was out, the preacher said words over them, and Bernice moved her and her girls' dresses into the house for good. The sickness came later, quiet at first. Her daddy got winded easy and had to sit more often for a spell. "Just getting older," he'd say. But the cough dug in, and the doctor began to come with his little black bag. One afternoon, Ella found old Judge Roy at the kitchen table with her daddy. Papers lay spread out, and Bernice stood behind her daddy's chair, one hand on his shoulder. "Run on out, Ella," her daddy had said, a tired kindness in his eyes. "Grown folks' business for a bit." She'd hesitated in the doorway long enough to hear Judge Roy rumble, "This way the farm's protected, held in trust till she's of age." Bernice's voice had floated after Ella as she stepped back onto the porch. "You can trust me in this. I'll see it's all tended proper." Ella never saw those papers again. When the cough finally carried her daddy off, the house felt both too full and too empty at the same time. Bernice wore black for the proper number of Sundays and then traded it for fancy, expensive dresses. Her daughters took over the good bedroom and the front room with its best chairs. Ella moved through the kitchen and fields like the hired help. "Ella, sweep this. Ella, fetch that. Ella, mend that." If she came in late from the farm work, supper would be mostly gone. Bernice sitting where her daddy should be, her stepsisters chattering. Ella would eat what was left, standing by the sink. Neighbors saw Ella working like a farmhand and worried. "If the girls needin' anything, Miss Bernice, you just holler. We all thought a lot of her daddy," they would say. The cold, cutting response would generally go along these lines. "Judge Roy put this place and that girl under my care. If any of you go meddlin', I'll have you in court so fast your head'll spin." Maud watched all this from further along the ridge, same way she'd watched Ella since she was small. She knew that neighbors were no longer welcome on the farm. She knew everyone went quiet when Bernice was around. Maud also knew about the trust that old Judge Roy had set up in Ella's name. One evening, Maud walked down to where Ella was hoeing the corn. "You're carrying a lot on them shoulders, girl," she said, resting her arms on the fence. Ella shrugged, not quite looking up. "Just work that needs doing." Maud watched her a long moment and then let out a slow breath. "Your daddy never meant it to be this way, girl," she murmured, so soft it was more for the land to hear than for Ella. She patted the fence rail, turned, and walked back up the ridge, keeping her own quiet tally of what was wrong and who might help her set it right. Maud watched the years turn, and it seemed like nothing changed. Then, one autumn, all that slow turning gathered itself toward a single night. The harvest festival was in the air. Men bragging on corn yields, women comparing prized recipes, and word went round that Judge Roy's boy Squire was back from law school. Bernice heard it all long before Ella did. The thought of old Judge Roy and his polished son put a hard shine in her eye. She filled the front room with ribbons and lace and a hired seamstress, turning her daughters into high-priced bait meant to hook the Roy name and tether her family to the judge's power forever. Meanwhile, Ella silently moved through the house, scrubbing, stirring, hauling ash, while festival talk floated past her as if she weren't there. She thought of other festivals from when her daddy was alive, lanterns swinging and music spilling down the road. But that belonged to another lifetime. It was a different kind of talk that caught Maud's attention. She heard how Bernice was fixing her girls up right. When someone asked quiet-like whether Ella would get to go, Maud silently shook her head. Her jaw set in that way it did when she decided a thing had gone on long enough. That same evening, Maud walked into her own back room and opened the chest she hadn't touched since her daughter's passing 10 years before. Folded there was the dress, a pale, shimmering blue that caught light like rippling water. It had been sewn with care, meant to be worn on special occasions down the years. But her daughter's life had been brief, and the dress had waited in that chest for joys that never came. Maud lifted it out, shook the folds loose, and laid it across her bed. "You wouldn't mind," she murmured to the empty room with a tear, thinking of her girl's laugh. "You'd have been the first to say so." In the days before the festival, the valley women began to arrive. One brought soft leather shoes with little buttons marching up the side. Another laid down a slender necklace, its stones the color of dawn. Teardrop earrings turned up, little drops of silver light that flashed when they turned. Bit by bit, the community built Ella the finest of outfits for the harvest dance. A silk shawl with elegant fringe, a fine petticoat, stockings as thin as gossamer. The ensemble looked magical, the kind of magic that comes from the hands and love of neighbors. "What if Bernice catches on to us?" one neighbor asked, worry knitting her brow. Maud's smile was small and hard. Bernice can't sue the whole valley for lending a dress. The day of the festival, Maud walked up the ridge with a basket of eggs on her arm, same as she had 100 times before. Inside, Bernice hurried her painted face past a mirror, snapping orders, her daughters fluttering by in bright dresses. "Those the eggs I ordered?" Bernice asked, tugging at a glove. "And a few extra," Maud said easily. "Figured you'd want a good breakfast tomorrow after all that dancing." Bernice laughed sharp and pleased with herself, and swept her girls out the door. In another minute, the wagon wheels were crunching down the lane. Silence flowed in behind them. Maud called out softly, "Ella?" Ella stepped out of the pantry, wiping her hands on her apron. With Bernice gone, she seemed to grow an inch, like a morning glory freed from the night. "We haven't got long," Maud said. "Come down to my place." Ella blinked. "But you've got to trust me," Maud said, voice gentle, but leaving no room for argument. "The house will be standing when you get back." In Maud's back room, the blue dress lay across the bed, catching the last of the afternoon light. The shoes, shawl, and jewelry waited beside it. Ella stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. "Oh," she cried. Who's all that for?" "For you, Ella," Maud said. Ella shook her head at first, hands trembling. "I can't wear that, Maud. That's too fine. Folks'll talk." "They're already talking," Maud said. "Only it's about how Bernice has you working yourself down to a shadow, while every scrap of your daddy's hard work is getting carted away. The folks gathered this finery for you." She took Ella by the shoulders, kind but firm. "You belong among us down there. This is so you remember that, same as we do." They washed the dust from Ella's hair and arms. She slipped out of her work dress and into the watery blue, the fabric settling over her as if someone had measured her in her sleep. The skirt fell in a soft bell, swaying when she turned. Maud eased the shoes onto Ella's feet, buttons snug against her ankles, then lifted the pale shawl around her shoulders so its fringe whispered when Ella turned. Her work-rough hands carefully fastened the necklace at Ella's throat and set the silver earrings to shining at her ears. Then Ella reached into her work dress pocket. Inside lay a carved walnut comb her father had made. She carried it always, its surface worn smooth by his making and all the years she'd turned it in her hands. She determined to wear it, the one thing this night that was wholly hers. "Seems right to take him with you," Maud said quietly. Ella lifted her hair and slid the comb into place. In the mirror's warped glass, the girl who stared back looked like a mountain princess. "Lord," Maud breathed, half prayer, half pride. "They won't know what hit 'em." Squire Roy was the wheel hub that the whole festival spun round that night. Folks gathered and scattered around him like leaves in a wind. Farmers wanting a word, church women squeezing his hand, girls in their best dresses easing closer whenever a set was called. If he minded, he didn't show it. He danced when asked, switched partners when called for, smiled and thanked and bowed his head. Bernice had planted herself where she could see it all. She sat straight as a pokeberry cane, her girls planted on either side. She watched it all with a tight little smile as if it all were a contest she plotted to win. When he turned to some stranger's daughter, her mouth pinched, then smoothed again. "You see that?" Bernice murmured encouragement to her daughters. "He doesn't dance twice with a one of 'em. You wait, things'll be different with one of you." For Ella, the walk to the festival field felt like crossing the thin place between worlds. Ella's heart thudded, not from the descent, for this slope was as familiar as her own hand, but from the thought of being discovered by her stepmother dressed like this. At the field's edge, Ella paused in the last shadow. The festival lay before her, lanterns swaying from poles, music spilling from the stage, tables heaped with fruits of the harvest. Maud squeezed her arm. "This is where you belong, Ella, and we're all here for you." Then she disappeared into the shadows to join the crowd. When Ella stepped into the light, conversations faltered. No one had ever seen her looking like this. Women who'd loaned a hanky or a pin or a word of courage watched her with quiet pride. Men remembered whose girl she was and thought how proud her daddy would be. Ella felt every eye, every whisper, but she kept moving. Those who knew her name held it on their tongues, watching. Under the lanterns, amid music and murmur, she stood to them as someone newborn, yet more herself than she had been in a long, long while. Squire Roy had just turned from thanking his latest partner when he saw her. Later, if anyone pressed him, he might have said it wasn't the dress, though it was finer than most. It was the way she stood there, the set of her shoulders, as if the floor could shift and she'd still find her footing. He did not look away. Bernice pitched her chin high and followed Squire's gaze. Ella came into view, and Bernice's eyes slid over her the way they would over any stranger. Not in recognition, but in rankled curiosity that someone else might outdo her two girls. Squire Roy moved through the crowd without much ceremony, only a few quiet "excuse me's" as he went. By the time he reached Ella, the fiddlers had slid into a slower tune, the sort made for twining hands and measured steps. Up close, he dipped his head. "Evening, miss," he said, stopping just in front of her. His voice was low. "Might I trouble you for a dance?" "You might," she said. Her own voice surprised her with how even it came. "If you don't mind, I'm out of practice." "I don't reckon that'll trouble us," he answered. "I'll do my best not to lead you astray." He offered his hand, and it was warm when she set her fingers in it. He led her into the set, and the room arranged itself around them. Ella's daddy taught her dances in the farmyard when she was small, so her feet knew what to do even while her mind reeled. They turned once, twice, his steps sure, hers finding the pattern with each pass. His eyes stayed mostly on her face. "You from this valley?" he asked. quiet as they swept past the bench where Bernice sat stiff as a fence post. "I am," she said, "just beyond that far ridge." She tipped her chin toward the dark shadow of a hill that stood against the sky. "Ah," he seemed to turn that over. "So you currently know these hills better than I do." "I expect they know me," she said, before she could think better of it. That made him look at her more closely. "Then you'd be the one to ask how this place is holding up. It's been too many years of me just riding through, and that's not the same as living under 'em." "Land's like a person," Ella said. The words felt like something her father might have said, rolling up from some deep place within her. "You can't tell much from riding past the front gate and waving." His hand tightened just a fraction. "No," he said, transfixed. "I suppose you can't." They swung so near Bernice's bench that Ella could have reached out to touch her. The woman's eyes were narrow slits, taking the measure of her as she danced at Squire's side. Heat and noise rushed back in at the edges of Ella's thoughts. For a moment she had let herself forget there was any world beyond the lantern light. Then the weight of it all rushed back on her. The borrowed dress, the long walk home, Maud's careful hands fastening every button, the woman on the bench who would have her hide if she was found here. "I have to go," Ella said, breath catching. The music had not quite finished, but she was already drawing her hand back. His brows lifted. "Did I step wrong?" "No," she said. "You stepped just fine." She tried to smile and almost managed it. "I've stayed longer than I meant." Before he could speak again, she slipped free. In her haste, Ella felt her hair fall free and the carved walnut comb drop from its place. In her panic, she left her precious comb behind and escaped into the shadows. Squire snatched up the comb and pushed through the crowd, reaching the festival's edge a heartbeat later, but all he could see was the empty road. The dark had swallowed her. He didn't even know her name. Then he studied the hair comb in his hand. The wood was still warm, worn smooth by years of handling. On the back, carved small and careful, was the looping initial E. He looked out toward the hills she'd pointed to, as if the land itself might answer who she was. Squire Roy didn't wait for the dew to dry before he was in the saddle the next morning. He rode with his thumb tracing the carved E in his pocket, determined to find the mystery girl who spoke of the land as if it were kin. At the first house, the daughter was already on the porch. "I figured you might come by," she said, her cheeks bright. Squire held out the beautifully carved comb. "Might you have lost this last night?" he asked. "Maybe," she replied, "but I have so many." She reached for it, but Squire held back. "Tell me, would you say you know these hills well?" he asked. The girl giggled. "I guess so. I know a fine spot for strolling if the company's right." That wasn't quite the answer he was looking for. So Squire politely tipped his hat and moved on. At the next stop, the mother took one look at the initial on the carved walnut and pulled her daughter inside. "You'd best ask on along, Squire," she whispered. "It's no business of ours." A neighborly man sitting on his porch rail studied the comb and wouldn't meet Squire's eye. "You're riding yourself toward trouble you don't understand," he muttered. By late afternoon, the pattern was plain as barbed wire. A flash of recognition, then silent tongues. Every knowing glance pointed the same way, deeper into the valley. He pushed on toward the low country where the rich bottomlands stretched out green and wide. Bernice was on the porch before his horse had stopped, her daughters flanking her like matched bookends. "Well now," Bernice said, her voice sweet as sorghum gone a little sour. "Judge Roy's boy all the way down my lane. What brings you to our humble place?" He held the comb out, but kept his thumb pressed firmly over the E. "I'm looking for the woman who belongs to this." Both girls surged forward. "It's mine," they cried, reaching for the wood. Bernice stepped between them, reaching for the comb with a practiced smile. "Hush, girls. Truth is, I carved this myself for my eldest. My hands have a knack for it." Squire didn't let go of the comb. He kept his thumb over the spine. "If you carve this, Bernice, you'll remember what's carved on the inside without needing to look." Bernice's eyes flickered. She looked at her daughters, then back at the comb. "A flower," the oldest guessed quickly. "A mountain laurel, I recall." "No," the other chimed in. "It was a vine, to match the embroidery on my shawl." Squire pulled the comb back and slipped it into his pocket. He looked past them to the clothesline, where a thin work dress swayed in the wind. "It's a letter," Squire said quietly. "An E, worn smooth by a hand that treasured it, and it doesn't belong to anyone standing on this porch." Bernice's smile thinned until it was nothing but a line. "My daughters are the only ones here. There's no one else." "That's a lie that's lived long enough," a voice rang out. There stood Maud, her face set like flint. She looked straight at Squire. "You want the girl who belongs to that comb? She's hid away doing most of the labor around here while these three sit in the shade." Maud stepped up onto the porch, her presence forcing Bernice back a step. "Ella," she called, her voice ringing out like a bell. "Come on out here. It's time you're seen proper." Ella stepped from the kitchen shadows, her face smudged and her hair covered in a kerchief. But as she moved into the light, Squire felt a jolt of recognition. It definitely wasn't the shimmer from the dance. It was the way she stood, the set of her shoulders, as if the floor could shift and she'd still find her footing. Squire stepped toward her, the walnut comb held out in his open palm. "If this is yours, can you tell me what's marked on the back?" Ella didn't hesitate. "It's an E," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My daddy carved it for me." "Liar and thief," Bernice shrieked. "She's a hired hand with a silver tongue." Maud stepped forward and spoke like a thunderclap. "She's the owner of this farm, Bernice, and you know it. Squire, you take this girl to your daddy. Tell him to pull out the trust papers, the one he signed before Bernice started tending things around here." "You can't take her," Bernice lunged forward, but Maud stood like an oak in her path. "I'm taking her," Squire said, his voice hard as stone. He offered Ella a hand up onto his horse. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as Squire Roy, Ella, and Maud headed up the ridge. Little by little, people stepped out onto their porches and then filed in behind. By the time Squire reached the courthouse, a dozen families trailed behind them, their silence finally breaking into a low, angry murmur. Bernice's wagon tore up the road, dust billowing as she and her daughters scrambled out, desperate to reach the judge. Inside, Judge Roy looked up from his desk as the room filled with the county folk. He looked at his son, then at the ragged girl. Surely this was not his friend's daughter. "Judge," Maud said, her voice ringing off the high ceilings, "we've stood by and let fear of this woman's threats keep us quiet, but that girl has been living like a slave in her own home while you sat in this office and took Bernice's word for gospel." The judge looked at the crowd of neighbors who were nodding in agreement. He saw the way his son stood beside Ella, and he felt the sharp sting of his own neglect. "I relied on the say-so of a liar," the judge murmured, "and ignored the truth in front of me." He stood up, reaching for his gavel. "The guardianship is revoked on grounds of fraud and abuse. The sheriff will see the farm returned." Seeing the tide had turned and the law was no longer on her side, Bernice didn't wait for the handcuffs. She and her daughters slipped out the side door and fled the valley for good. A week later, Squire found Ella at the edge of the river field as the sun was climbing over the ridge. She was wearing her old work dress. but her hair was clean and held back by the walnut comb her daddy had carved her so long ago. "I heard the neighbors are helping you mend the back fence," Squire said, leaning against a post. "They are," Ella said, looking out over the pastures. "Said they owed it to my daddy." Squire was quiet for a moment. He just looked at the way the light hit the hills. "It's like this place is holding its breath," he said softly. "My daddy and I have enough law books to pave the road to town, but none of them can teach me about a place like this." They stood there together, watching the ridge let out its breath in a soft, rising fog. Two figures against the sparkling gold of the valley. "I was wondering if you'd mind if I walked the fences with you now and again," Squire said, breaking the morning silence. "I expect I have a lot to learn about how to make a place remember me kindly." Ella looked at him, a small, genuine smile reaching her eyes. "It'll be a long walk, Squire Roy." "I'm a good walker," he answered.